Welcome to CUTC's fifth and for now final panel of the series on changing the tide in transportation. I'm pleased that CUTC has received support and active encouragement for this series from AASHTO, ATBA, ASCE, and the ENO Center. So as we all know, transportation is the lifeblood of society and our communities. And this is no more clear to many of us than the origins of the civil rights movement, which started with Claudette Colvin, a teenager who refused to give up her seat about 8 months before Rosa Parks, actually. And that led to the one-year Montgomery bus boycott and a civil disobedience movement, which culminated in, of course, as we know, the Supreme Court striking down the Alabama State and Montgomery City bus segregation policy. You know, just clearly the importance of transportation to society. So the question we might ask is, have things changed much from that disobedience movement to the Black Lives Matter movement last summer? Research has consistently and continually demonstrated the systemic discrimination in transportation provision, whether it be insufficient walking and rolling infrastructure, higher rates of traffic injuries and fatalities among specific minority groups, and Black pedestrians more likely to be represented in pedestrian fatalities, and of course, Black and single parents in particular more likely to have long commutes. So we initiated this series to bring more attention to underlying issues of disparate transportation provision and better understand equity considerations. Toward this end objective, we had multiple webinars, as we all know, starting from lived-in experiences, defining the problem as it pertains to Black Americans, how can we as UTCs and CUTC members create a more supportive opportunity, and how do we build relationships and work with community-based organizations. Now, full credit to the steering committee members for standing up and actually making this webinar series come to fruition. B.S. Sriraj, Melissa Tooley, Carol Abel-Lewis, Juan Mathieu, and Kamel Kamga. And I would be remiss if I did not thank Tracy Ulberg for all her logistics and organization for this panel series. So today we will have a culmination of the Tide panel series by talking with the steering committee members who planned this entire series so that they can summarize their thoughts and provide us some sense of some tangible ways we can move forward and promote transportation equity. So with that, I'm going to start the conversation by asking a simple question to each of the panelists, and I would ask the panelists to please provide brief responses before we go into a much more of a dialogue. A few housekeeping issues though. The mute button is in the bottom left corner. Please keep yourself muted unless the session is open for questions. On the right side of the screen, you will see a session Q&A. Please do post your questions in this tab. The chat tab in the Zoom feed is disabled, but you can use the chat tab in the Whova screen. And so now to start things off, to each of the panelists, what would be one takeaway for you all from this exchange we have had as part of the panel? So going down the video screens I have here, Sriraj, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chandra. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone who's in different parts of the world. It's a shame that we cannot be meeting in person, but nonetheless, happy to be here. Happy to have been part of such a wonderful experience. Thanks to CUTC and thanks to my colleagues in the steering committee for shepherding this process through. And Chandra, you asked a very pertinent question. What was the single biggest takeaway? There were wonderful educational opportunities throughout the series for me personally, for many of those that were in audience throughout the series, from the identification of need for metrics to lack of knowledge about transportation decision process in communities. There's many things that we heard throughout the 4 or 5 month long event. But if you had to ask me for one seminal thought that resonated with me, I would go back to the lived in experiences of the many panel members that talked about how they went through the 60s and 70s and how impactful those have been for me as an individual who has come from another country, been here 30 years, but still didn't really understand the depth of the injustice and the segregation that was happening back then. That was for me the most powerful takeaway. It struck my heart, it brought tears to my eyes, and it really will stay with me forever. As people say, those that forget history are really going to be repeating that, and so that's something that we have to keep in front of our radars and make sure that we catalog those lived in experiences as much as we can. So that's one takeaway for me. There's many such comments, but that's the one thing that I would share here.
Thank you, Sriraj. Melissa?
Thanks, Chandra. And also, too, thank you for recognizing those of us on the steering committee, but I also want to recognize you, Chandra, for your passion for this topic and for, kind of spearheading CUTC doing this. Also, we came about this sort of in parallel paths, because my interest in this topic came about from a conversation that I had with Greg Winfrey, who is TTI's agency director and a former assistant Secretary of Transportation and the head of the office that actually the former head of the office that administers the UTC program. And after having kind of a private conversation with him, I had sort of an aha moment and asked if he would be willing to share his experiences with a wider audience through CUTC, and he agreed to do that. And when I called Chandra to see if CUTC would be interested in hosting such a thing, found out that Chandra and Siraj had already been talking about doing something like this through CUTC. So, very, I guess, complementary initiatives that joined together. And I've had an awful lot of aha moments through this. And I will tell you that I was guilty of projecting my own experiences onto this topic. I felt like I understood discrimination because, I'm a female engineer who has had all of my career in the South. So I've certainly experienced discrimination. But I think my aha moment was when I realized, yes, I've experienced discrimination, but I can honestly say that I never felt like my life was in danger, and I never felt like the young women that I was mentoring, that they needed to understand that there might be times when people who are tasked with protecting them, may not have their best interests at heart in a very physical way. That was a very eye-opening experience for me. And I honestly thought that education and social status would somehow magically lift people from experiencing racism. I was shocked when I had that discussion with Greg and he shared some of his experiences with me that he then went on to share with the audience in that first webinar. Carol Abel Lewis, my dear friend, we've been friends for many years and had never talked about racial issues at all until we started working on this together. And thank you, Carol, for agreeing to do this when I called and begged you to do it. But the truth is that racism is real, and education, a PhD in engineering, a status as an assistant secretary of the Department of Transportation, those things do not magically lift you from racism. And that, for me, was the key takeaway from this series.
Very well said, Sriraj and Melissa. Let's move to Carol.
So I wanted to echo all the thanks that have been expressed by my fellow co-workers on this committee, and really appreciate the opportunity to have served on it. I mean, what might be obvious is that I am African American. My ancestry goes back to the early 1800s as far as we've been able to trace it, so that we know that my ancestors were in fact slaves. The thing that I would say has been sort of the biggest takeaway for me. I also teach at an HBCU, so I'm sort of enmeshed in the culture all the time. But I think what's happened for me over the last year is I've done more thinking about the specifics than I had in a really long time. You know, as an African American, you just go through it, you just do it. You don't really think about what's happening around you, why it's happening. You don't really question the racism, because if it's there, there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to press through. And so there were many things, honestly, I had forgotten until we really started talking about this again. And so it pulled up lots of memories for me. I would say that the biggest takeaway I have from the sessions we've had is, number one, that we're dealing with something that has been built over centuries. And so we're not going to fix it next year. So we really all have to recognize that it's going to take us a while to come out of it, just like it took us a while to get in it. I would say that for me, secondarily, is the fact that the approach and the addressing it needs to be tiered. It both has to be organizational, sort like CUTC is doing, like USDOT is doing. I know many of you are getting probably daily invitations to different sessions that are dealing with diversity and equity from just a variety of sources. And so I think all of those are going to be important from the organizational sphere. The other piece of it is that we all are going to have to do our part as individuals, because the organizations, if the organizations are doing it, it's going to be sort of systematic and structured. We all have to individually do our part to make sure that things are better in order for it to really become a part of our environment and our culture, and not just something we're doing as an initiative. And so I think that, you know, as we kind of talk about where we want to go, for me, that's one thing. I want to get to the point where this is just organic for us, and it's not something that we have to work so hard to accomplish. So I'll sort of end that with my sort of takeaways from our first series of meetings, and look forward to the rest of the conversation over the next hour.
Thank you so much, Carol. Let's go to Juan.
Well, thank you, Chandra, and thank you to CUTC and my fellow committee members for inviting me to be a part of planning the series. I've really enjoyed it. Juan Matute, Deputy Director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, working for Brian Taylor, who you may have seen speaking in the previous session. I've been leading our equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives at UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. And one of my takeaways, I think, you know, UTCs, University Transportation Research Centers, we're often in competition with each other for grants, for projects, and then, you know, the next UTC recompetition, and thinking often of each other as competitors or potential collaborators. And as other speakers have mentioned, this is a major issue, and addressing racial equity in transportation research and education will take forging new relationships and working together across UTCs. So I see this series and this effort by CUTC as an instrumental part in making that happen.
Thank you, Juan. Unfortunately, Kamil Kamga, another member of the steering committee, was not able to join us today. He is traveling internationally somewhere in Africa. But I will say that Kamil's viewpoints were extraordinary, just like everyone else's on the steering committee. Just sad that he could not be here for the final panel. So, you know, many of you, Sriraj and Melissa, you talked about getting a better appreciation, an aha moment of what it is really to not have appropriate or enough adequate transportation provision and well beyond in daily life. Carol and Juan, you talked about needing to recognize this issue. And when you meant recognize, I assume you meant recognize that there is inequity right now in our transportation systems. So I'm going to ask in the reverse order, Juan, Carol, Melissa, and Sriraj, and it can be a dynamic discussion. What would you tell people who don't think anything should be done to change how things are going? That is, those who believe that everyone has the same chance right now. And in Carol's terminology, look at history from a very different vantage point.
Yeah, I think in terms of those who see, perhaps equality and everybody being treated equally, rather than equity, having everybody achieve some similar level of outcomes, which means different level of support for each. I think that some of that comes from lived experience and somebody who feels that they were able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that they've faced disadvantage. I think one thing that's important to recognize is that disadvantage is not a binary, it's not absolute. Different people face different levels of disadvantage, of overt oppression, of people not looking out for their interests. I think in her opening comments, Melissa, who it looks like we've lost temporarily, mentioned that she knows that she has experienced disadvantage as a woman in the South in transportation engineering, but that she recognizes that there's an additional level of disadvantage that other people have experienced. And I think recognizing that, learning that is an important step in recognizing that different people may need different levels of support to rise up to that level, that they can perform as academics, to learn the same, to get the same amount of learning out of a class or an experience as their peers. And so that's why I think it's important.
Thank you, Juan. Carol?
I would say to just have this conversation, a question that could be asked is, if one is a statistician and 12 to 13% of Americans are African Americans, then if everything were equal and equitable, one might think that we would see 12 to 13% of African Americans in all of our areas in transportation. That is not the case. And so, another sort of statistic for all these engineers, the percentage of engineers in 2018, graduated Black engineers, was slightly over 4%. That's down from almost 6% in 1998. So if everything is equitable, why are the percentages going down? Why is it that we don't see that? I mean, you almost have to say, there's this saying that, a tree by the fruit it bears. So if the fruit is not showing that we're equitable, why would you think we are? One of the things that just blew my mind at the beginning of the month was the admission by the NFL that they have been using this race category in deciding whether players get to go through that CE evaluation, and starting off with the basic presumption that Black players have a lower cognitive skills when they're testing them. I mean, this is 2021. Are you kidding me? So how much of that is going on in the backdrop that we don't know? So the thing about the systemic question is there's so much that we don't know because they're not going to tell us. And so we have to look at the fruit. What is the fruit? What are we seeing in our environments? If everything is equitable, then statistically and randomly, we should be seeing those numbers across the board, and we're not.
Thank you, Carol. Sriraj, you want to add anything?
I believe Melissa has called in, but I can go ahead and then comment on the discussion. Who cares? Why it matters, right? Those were the questions that we started out the series with. And how can we link it to what we do? That was the premise on which this entire series was built. And when you talk about people that may not have the same worldview as you do, then it behooves us as a collective to expose them to that worldview that we are exposed to, and hope that it changes their perception, it changes their outlook over time, right? I mean, it's not what we are dealing with in transportation is just a small microcosm within the bigger puzzle that is society. So their views are going to be influenced by everything else that they have been exposed to growing up in their formative years. So there's going to be a whole lot of things that need to be done collectively. And that's why the systemic term is so important from societal perspective, from the transportation perspective. And if all of this happens, then the most fundamental question that we asked within the steering committee, Chandra and others, is that, is there a difference between equity and equality? And do everyone understand it? That is the crux of all of this. Because even those that may say that they do not care may be not totally understanding equity and thinking that it is equality. And so that is part of this. It's such a complex issue, but those are my thoughts on how this needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Sriraj. Melissa, I think you called in.
Yes, sir. I am back, and I'm assuming that we're talking about, you know, how to make sure that people understand why this is important. And I'm sorry, it booted me off as you were posing the question.
Yes, that is right, Melissa.
Okay. You know, I think it boils down to communication. You know, again, this whole journey for me started with listening and, you know, asking, you know, how are you doing? And then listening carefully to the answer. I think people who don't fundamentally get why this is important should be afforded the same consideration. If someone doesn't seem to understand why this is important, ask them why. Because, you know, again, the only way to, and you may not, some people's minds can't be changed. Some people can't be influenced in any way. But I think everybody has the same basic need to be heard, you know, and make sure that, you know, it's possible that you could address some of those concerns. My aha moment came about when I realized that I never felt like my life was in danger because of the color of my skin. And again, that came about because someone took the time to talk to me. I think also, too, it's very important for people to understand that not only are equity considerations the right thing to do, they are also the smart thing to do. Because we do have workforce challenges in our profession. We need to tap the talents of diverse talent pools. We're never going to be able to fully address or even meaningfully address equity issues in research unless we have those voices at the table in the research community. So I feel like the very survival of our profession is at stake. Also, the things that our Black colleagues want are the things that we all want. If equity issues are addressed within the work environment, you know, people feel heard, people feel understood, people feel like their challenges are being addressed. It's going to result in a healthier work environment for everyone. And that is just smart business.
So all of you alluded in your responses to the importance, and actually this works for everyone if we have diversity and inclusion in our professional workforce. So let me ask you a related question. Like Sriraj and many others, I came to this country, you know, I would say in the past 30, 35 years or so. But this country, as I know it, was built on the notion of no taxation without representation, a voice that arose in Boston and then enveloped much of the country. So my question is, if that was the basis of the birth of this country, why is it still taking so long to realize that, you know, we cannot contribute to society and better society if we don't, if in our decision makers and beyond and in our profession, we do not represent that society? Why is that still difficult to get as a message across the board? I think it is kind of related to the question earlier and the responses you all provided, but just a broad question. If representation and no taxation if I'm not represented was really the loud voice for the birth of this country. Why hasn't it permeated through? Anyone want to go forward? Just it's a very philosophical, very general question, something that just came to me as I was listening to all of you.
Well, I'll take a crack at it. At least we'll get the conversation started. And mainly because I think, Chandra, this is not an engineering problem. This is a complex problem that has multiple goals and multiple objectives that are not usually agreed upon. When you have such a lack of agreement on the basic goals and objectives, and the methods themselves, that is a separate issue altogether, because there are no clear-cut methods to address them. And the usual example that I give to many of my students is that when President Kennedy was sworn in, he made two proclamations. One was to put a man on the moon in the next 10 years and would eradicate poverty. One of them happened, the other one didn't. And the reasons are very simple, because the methods were known, the goal was very clear, the resources were available. They put the man on the moon before the end of this decade. But the other one has still been languishing. And that's mainly because of the complexity of the issue. And so it has to start at the grassroots, as many of the panelists in the webinar series mentioned. You need to have the community be involved. You need to have students of color be exposed to what engineering means, what other disciplines mean at the formative stages, so that they can pick a career of their choice, of their liking. There's a whole lot that needs to come from the grassroots level, in my opinion, because unless you equip them and empower them, there's going to be still a big divide.
Thank you, Sriraj. Juan, Carol, Melissa, you feel you want to add anything more to that?
Well, I think it's a hard question, right? And I think it probably does not have a single response. But I think that a part of it is that exactly what Sriraj was saying, is that we don't have universal agreement that we really want that to be our goal. And then so what you partner with it is people who come to the table sort of with, I think Juan was talking about this early on, and maybe Melissa a little bit too, is not really understanding the difference between equity and equality. So a lot of those folks feel like equality is good enough, right? So you have a 50-yard line and everybody starts at the 50 and does their best. I think the thing that's missing, and this is where a lot of the education comes in, and the fact that we don't know our history, is that everybody's not starting at the 50. There have been things that have happened that keep a whole segment of our country who've not started at the 50. They've been pushed back. And I think an example of that, we've just gone through the whole week of talking about the Tulsa riots. Well, the thing about Tulsa was it wasn't a city by itself. There was a city called Boley, Oklahoma, that doesn't exist anymore, that was all Black. There was Rosewood in Florida. I mean, that was not the only place where African Americans were doing just fine and they were pushed back. So therefore, it would, a lot of people are not actually starting at the 50. They're starting behind the 50. But I think people don't understand it. They don't recognize it, because they don't know the history. And so, again, why is it that we haven't achieved it? It's because, number one, everybody doesn't want to achieve it. And secondarily, some people don't want to achieve it probably because they just want to stay at the top. Let's be frank. Other people don't want to achieve it because they don't fully understand the complexity of the problem. They don't understand that things are not really equal in this country. From where they sit, everything is equal. You get there, you work hard, you pull yourself up with your bootstraps, and we're all alike. So I think people don't understand that, we're not all alike. We don't come to it at the same place. When you look at the high schools around the country, they're not the same. Everybody's not getting the same education.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carol. Melissa and Juan?
I can go while Melissa's on.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think to go back to the specifics of the question, well, taking it literally, the Americans had to fight for representation. Receiving tax dollars without ceding power worked perfectly fine for the British. and they didn't necessarily think that that was an issue. And so that process of having that representation is something that had to be fought for. And I think, you know, now in this country, there are people who benefit not by individually being personally discriminatory against Blacks and people of color, but who benefit from that systemic effect and don't necessarily feel a need to intervene and change that, just as some, you know, common British person probably liked the extra services the tax paid for and didn't really think about people in the colonies.
Thank you, Juan. Melissa?
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of going back to what Carol was talking about, you know, I was one of the people that was really confused about the difference between equity and equality. I'll be full disclosure. I mean, again, I'm one of the people that needed to be educated extensively, and you guys have done a great job of doing that. But I think one of the very best examples that I heard was when Carol shared with us about, you know, the college entrance exams, because it's very easy to sit back and say, oh gosh, you know, where you either you either have the knowledge and make the score or you don't. So, gosh, it seemed like a pretty fair way to gauge whether they were, you know, whether students are college ready or not. I mean, you know, if they make a higher score, then they're probably more college ready. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because some people have access to the Kaplan courses and, you know, all the things. I mean, I look back on our experience when my daughter was applying for colleges and how incredibly complicated and difficult that process was. And here I have, you know, here I am in academia, you know, I've got a PhD, I theoretically should understand how all this works. And it was still challenging for our family. And if you look at these first generation students, many of them who are of color, it is not the same playing field when they walk in to take the ACT or the SAT than it is for us. I mean, Carol's story about, you know, I'm not going to take Carol's story. If she's got time to share it, I think it's certainly it's a story that everyone should hear, you know, about their family's experience with the college entrance exams. So Carol, I'll put you on the spot, but it's a really enlightening story.
So Carol, you know, we do still have some time before I move to something more specific. I would like us to talk a little bit more about where the panel thinks CUTC should go with this. What are some of the tangible things that each one of us can do within our institutions and beyond? But before we get to that, Carol, please go ahead and share the story.
All right, thank you, Chandra. So the story is that when my daughter got ready to go to college, and we're, you know, getting ready for the college entrance exams, I look around, and this has been more than 20 years, because she's not a kid anymore. She's almost 40. But so I'm looking around at college entrance exams. The first one was Princeton Review. It was $1,500. The second one was Kaplan's. It was $1,000. And honestly, we didn't have that kind of money. I'm a university professor at a state institution. I couldn't afford that. So I keep looking around. I finally find a little local group that does it for $500. So we get in there, and out of 200 kids, there are 5 Blacks, my daughter and all her friends. Nobody else even knew about it. So how does someone know that you need to pay for a college entrance exam? Now, of course, they did just fine. But what about all the students who don't know, and their parents who don't know that this is what they need to do to somehow prep for this test? So that's the short version of the story. So thank you for bringing it up, Melissa. But what we do ourselves, I'm gonna go back to what I started off saying. I think each of us individually has to make a commitment to make things better in our own environment. In the very first session, we heard from Greg Winfrey and Dorval Carter that they shared and mentored each other, even though they were in sort of different streams of USDOT. So I think that's one thing. You know, mentor your other colleagues. Make sure that you are paying attention to your students. Open doors that make it easier for your students to engage with each other. You know, sort of put them on projects that take them beyond just doing the project with their friends. And then I think within your institutions, I think you can ask for programs. I mean, we heard from the University of Arkansas and what they're doing at Portland State about programs that can be established to sort of help with some of the things we want to accomplish. So just quickly, I think those are the two sort of, you know, again, bookends of it. what we do individually and what we do within our organizations.
Juan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it does take that combination of individual efforts, specifically having a champion within each institution. It could be a staff person, a support person, or a junior faculty who's interested in supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion within their organization. But as that person and others who have embarked on this journey have likely found out, there is no manual to implementing equity, diversity, and inclusion at a transportation research and education center. So I think that, you know, where CUTC can come in is being that information sharing network for those individuals involved in this effort to connect with each other, to find what works, what doesn't. It doesn't necessarily need to be through a webinar series that we're delivering that. It can be opportunities in the future through email discussions and other forums to provide that support, because you deal with the administrative issues of figuring out various things of how to compensate you know, non-governmental partners in your research that might be community-based organizations. But then you also deal with some of those issues like how do you address this formally with somebody who sees equality as the objective and not equity. And, you know, that might be somebody's first time encountering that in a professional setting. And so providing that support through the CUTC network, I think, is important.
Thank you, Juan. The issue of providing more resources and beyond resources, which might just be at some site, ensuring that there is actual exchange of thoughts and information through perhaps in-person meetings or webinars or some other means. I think it's certainly something helpful. Sriraj and Melissa, what else would you like to add, also in the context of you know, how do we reach out as transportation organizations, as CUTC, to engender more representation in our universities and beyond?
I'll go ahead and jump in real quickly. You know, I think we have opportunities through some of the ideas that we've heard through the webinar series. I mean, I go back to what Thomas Carter was talking about at the University of Arkansas, the mentoring program that they've been doing for years, and it's been very, very successful. But in order to mentor those students, you've got to get them there first. And, you know, in that regard, K through 12 programs, outreach programs are are wonderful tools for bringing underrepresented population students into the university environment, interesting them in transportation in the first place. And to that end, I would say that as you know, this is an organization of center directors, of university transportation centers. Partner with your HBCUs for their summer outreach programs. I've been doing that through my UTCs since well before I joined TTI. And it's a great way to foster relationships with faculty at HBCUs that can move on into research relationships too. But also it's a great way to use UTC resources to reach out to these students in a K through 12 environment that their families are comfortable sending them to, because they're based at HBCUs. And that's something that I think is a lot more comfortable for families of color to send their kids to a, you know, multi-week program at an HBCU. So that is something concrete that we can do to maybe help enhance that pipeline of students of color, you know, into our programs. And then also too, you know, the relationship that you build in doing that provides another mechanism for partnering on research. You know, don't wait until there's a NOFO out and say, oh, you know, we need to run out and find an HBCU. I mean, sometimes that works, but I mean, I don't know that I'd be comfortable with someone calling me that didn't know me and they're all ready to partner on something. And I see Carol smiling because I know that that's happened. Yeah, I know that happens all the time. build those relationships now. So you've got good relationships with people that you can partner with in the future, and working together on these outreach programs through your UTCs is a great way to start that.
Thank you, Melissa. Sriraj?
Ooh, where do I start? Because it's so complex. But there are many things we heard throughout, and I'll lean heavily on the webinar series itself from our speakers. They pointed out examples of confusion between Title VI and NEPA process in Corpus Christi in Texas, how to integrate civil rights in the design process. There's a whole slew of issues that people are not really sure about. How do you make equity real in research with community partners? Is another area that we can definitely try to move forward about. More importantly, in our first webinar, Dorval Carter and Jackie Grimshaw talked about how the communities are completely in the dark about, and they have no knowledge about how the transportation decision process works. Now, all of this can be addressed at some level by transportation centers through reaching out to communities, bringing them into the fold. For others, you need to be a supporter. For example, if you have an MPO that is including community partners in their decision processes, how can you help build capacity on the community organization side so they can participate in planning processes in a very meaningful manner? A whole lot of things can be done, but it cannot be done just within the transportation realm. Transportation has to open itself up to include others from various walks of life, so that transportation centers and faculty members can be a conduit for this to move forward, if that makes sense.
So all of you touched upon this issue of needing to have that societal connection, needing to go beyond our usual, typical, if you will, partners, collaboration, just expanding our network, expanding our thoughts, and expanding beyond our institutions and going into communities. But starting on the other end, which we all do perhaps very well already, at least I would like to think so, which is research. So we all do a whole bunch of research work. And there are legitimate concerns today that some of the research we are doing, including automation, etc., might be engendering potentially more inequity than without some of these automation and innovative technologies. Not to say that that is the reason not to get there, but can you all speak to what kinds of research we should be perhaps more involved with in appreciating, in being able to disseminate, and being able to address and potentially even choreograph the evolution of these new technologies in a way that actually builds more equity? Juan, I see you nodding your head, so why don't you go ahead?
The UC system is thinking about standing up a research initiative on automated vehicles and equity. So it's something I've put a little bit of thought into. And I think, it's often a difference of perspective. So an engineer, especially a transportation engineering person who works on automated vehicle systems and is aware of their safety benefits, sees all the potential for positive things to happen with that change, lowering the cost of shared ride, Uber type services, et cetera, that would bring more access to people. But there are communities, people who often, when something changes, do not receive any of the benefits. The system is not planned for them to receive the benefits, and the benefits of that mobility, increase in access, don't trickle down to them. And so there can be a difference between the technical solution of providing a new type of service based on advanced technology, and the implementation, often more complex, with people in neighborhoods thinking of programs that introduce the service, provide ensure that people are safe in their communities with the vehicles going around, and that provide subsidies or programs to defray the cost if there's a differing ability to pay. And so you do have to match that technical effort with an understanding of what's possible, with deliberate interventions to make sure that what is possible and the benefits of these systems are distributed equally, or equitably, which includes outreach and understanding what people may want from this new system being available or just running through their community.
Thank you, Juan. Carol?
So, Chandra, this might be an opportunity to talk about why it's important to have all the people represented at the table. In Houston, we just finished a demonstration with an automated vehicle. Because we're an HBCU, because we have a transportation program, we work with Houston Metro and our Houston Galveston Area Council for the demonstration to be on our campus. So it ended last year, but now Metro is pursuing phase 2. What's always been on the table is that phase 2, we want to service the public housing project across the street from Texas Southern University. So that's what we're going to do with the second phase. There was an opportunity to, utilize the vehicle somewhere else, in other parts of town, but because, the people at the table, both from Metro, HGAC, and TSU, were able to say, let's do this community, let's do Third Ward, which happens to be where George Floyd lived. And actually it's CUNY Homes, the apartment complex that he grew up in. It's across the street from TSU. So our automated vehicle phase 2 is going to go from Metro's light rail station over past TSU to CUNY Homes. And again, so I think it speaks to why you want people at the table, because the way you get representation in the communities is that the voices around the table are saying, here's an opportunity, let's do it in this particular location.
Thank you, Carol. Melissa and Sriraj?
There's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am doing really amazing things with equity research. And we've heard about some of that through the series. And I call them out, but I'm afraid I missed somebody really obvious. And I applaud that. I also think, we're seeing more and more opportunities to do, equity type research through USDOT, through state DOTs. And I absolutely applaud all of those opportunities. And I think it will result in some really meaningful information that we can use to affect change. But what I would like to see, I think more long-term, is for equity to become something that's integral to all of our research. It's integral to our research process as literature reviews and statistical analysis. And I really feel that unless it becomes kind of a baseline for everything that we do and not just a separate area of research, that we're not going to get where we need to be.
Thank you, Melissa, for that thought about needing to integrate, and Juan and Carol for the issue that we need representation exactly for ensuring that there is equity in everything moving forward. So Sriraj?
I think one of the things that we should do as technology evolves and there is genuine fears about people being marginalized out of that advancement is to work with agencies and transportation providers to address these issues that may be appearing on their radar. Just give you an example, when smart cards were the rage back in the early 2000s in transit systems, the most pressing issue then was how will the unbanked be able to take advantage of it. And then over a period of time, in about 20 years, we have come to a point where all these transit agencies have come out with smart cards that everyone can use. So they worked with the credit card manufacturers, they worked with industry, and they figured it out. So as we as academics can be there in a service role or in a research role that can bring up these issues and highlight them for the agencies and communities to work on them, I think that's an important issue that and contribution that we can make as academics.
Thank you all. This has been wonderful. I will say that there was a question that we will not be able to take up in this conversation, but the question was, how do we address cross-cultural issues when people of different cultures and even different nationalities, for example, there are, quite a few people from Asian countries who are represented in the transportation field. And there was a question about how do we be inclusive, embracing in everything we do, going beyond and respecting perspectives that come from different cultures. We will not be able to get to that. For the person who asked that question, we focus this on the African American experience primarily and the Black experience, but those are very valid questions. So before we end the session, let me just give an opportunity to each of the panelists to make a quick, brief remark, summarizing. So Juan?
I'd just say this is an ongoing effort. This is the conclusion of the series, but I hope that people who have participated are energized to continue the work.
Thank you. Carol?
We have our commencement ceremonies when our young folks finish their degrees. So I would say, let's look at this as a commencement, sort of the same thing Juan said. And as we all, get to whatever June 2022, make sure we're still talking about this. And thank you. It's been a heartwarming experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Sriraj?
I will echo all the sentiments that my fellow panelists have stated, but one thing that I want to reiterate, which Melissa alluded to, is that this should not be a fad. We are riding this as it is cresting, and there is a whole lot of attention and discussion, validly so, about equity in society, equity in transportation. It should not just fall off the radar when there is a change in priority, either at societal level or at the governmental level. So that would be the sincere hope going forward.
Thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, I was just going to say, again, kind of like Carol, this has been a labor of love for sure. And it's been quite the growth journey, I think, for all of us on the steering committee. And I hope for all of you who've chosen to join us. But, when we originally decided to focus on the Black experience, we originally started talking about doing this kind of for all underrepresented populations. And we learned very quickly, every underrepresented population has their own unique circumstances. And, our Black colleagues have a very unique set of circumstances that Carol can describe to you far more eloquently than I can. But, our profession is made up of diverse groups of people. And I think what's really important for us to going forward is for us all to try to understand what those unique circumstances are. And I think it starts with communication, asking them, hey, what are the things that are keeping you from doing what you need to do professionally? And even more importantly, how can I help you address those? It starts with one-on-one communication, and it starts with caring about your colleagues. And if we haven't learned anything else from this, I think I've learned more about how to care for my colleagues of color, and I kind of look forward to seeing what CUTC does with this moving forward.
Thank you all. Two things that clearly stand out. This should not be an ephemeral, fleeting discussion or an issue. This has to go on. And I'm confident that CUTC will take this on and will do all it can to move the needle, as Anne Brock mentioned in one of the webinars in this series. And I'd also say that, this is at the end about human dignity. Poor or rich or on the streets or having a palatial home, the one thing we all need and that's important to us is our self-respect and our dignity. And I am sure that this conversation, thanks to all of you, will move us forward in better appreciating that need, as Melissa just alluded to also. So let me end this webinar series by thanking each one of you, as well as Kamel Kamga, who, again, as I mentioned, could not join us, but has been an amazing steward also of all these discussions. So thank you again for joining.